favourite written pieces by Dostoevsky so far is The Grand Inquisitor from the brothers Karamazov. The reason for this is because it confronts some of the major existential concepts in existentialism, such as freedom, morality, meaning, the human condition, etc. But also because it holds an attack against Christ and Christianity with regards to spiritual freedom. Thus, what you have is this amazing piece which also ties in with many Nietzschean ideas such as the attempted God-man or Übermensch, the re-evaluation of values and slave morality. What I will try to do in this video is to cohesively explain how all these ideas interlink together and then give like a little rebuttal to the modern times in which we are living in and how it also relates in a strange way. The Grand Inquisitor is a spoken poem in the book which is told by Ivan, one of the three brothers in the book. The reason why Ivan is important in this is because he is the most intellectual out of the three, and this forces him to juggle with not only ideas but also his religious perspective. So this poem is very much his expression of playing the devil's advocate, but also an expression of his personal thoughts. It goes as follows. A man in the street who is giving blessings to the poor and struggling is noticed by an extension of the church. As this is during the Inquisition, he is seen as performing heresy and is thus brought into a cell where the Grand Inquisitor, or Ivan for that matter, will start his philosophical presentation. What the Inquisitor states is basically that Jesus made a big mistake when he was tempted by Satan in the wilderness. The first temptation was to perform a miracle. Satan asked the supposed Son of God to turn these stones into bread, but he denied. The second was to prove that he was actually the Son of God by throwing himself off a mountain, to let the angels take charge of his fall, but again he refuses. And the last temptation was to rule over the world under worship of Satan, but again to finally refuse the offer. What the Inquisitor points out is that all these rejections that Christ makes during the temptation are him squandering the chances to remove suffering from the world, and the suffering in which the human race experiences. By doing so, he brings into the world, or for the people of the world, an ability which the human race cannot actually sufficiently tolerate, which is spiritual freedom. This is because he chooses the free path over what the devil is tempting him with. Thus, this freedom is just something people will not be able to handle. For example, when we have freedom, we struggle with morality, altruism, and egoism. In these three human characteristics that are included are also motives within societal development. To question and make decisions with regards to all this shows the difficulties of freedom. It could also be stated that our freedom, paradoxically, brings about the wonders of life and also the most supreme of confusions, mysteries, and enigmas. Thus I quote, "Freedom, free thought and science will lead them into such straits and will bring them face to face with such marvels and insoluble mysteries, that some of them, the fierce and rebellious, will destroy themselves," the Inquisitor says. "Others, rebellious but weak, will destroy one another, while the rest, weak and unhappy, will crawl, fawning, to our feet." End quote. So what comes next? What has the Church done in response to this? Well, for the Grand Inquisitor, it is to take away man's freedom with the intent of getting rid of suffering. And this is where Dostoevsky writes something brilliant for this character, in which he says, "Man was created a rebel, and how can rebels be happy?" End quote. For the Church, in this instance, has sided with Satan. I quote, "We are not with thee, but with him. And this is our secret. For centuries we abandoned thee to follow him." End quote. And therefore the Church focuses on comfort over freedom, for example, feeding the poor. And this is to take the rebellious side out of man, to remove his freedom so that people can become reliant on the Church in this instance. Now, what really got my mind racing and seriously blew me away was when he writes about how the Church in the story takes away freedom of man by using miracle, mystery, and authority. Because the entire reason why the Grand Inquisitor incarcerates the second coming of Christ is because he towards the rebellious and sinful majority of mankind is refusing to unify their worship through the use of miracle, mystery and authority, as the church would. But here is the kicker. How is miracle, mystery and authority being used today? Or where in the world is it being used today to take away the spiritual freedom of the people? Miracle equals vaccine, mystery equals COVID-19, authority equals lockdown and the Great Reset, or the Great Reset. Just an idea. And here is the quote which puts it all together and in context. This is the Grand Inquisitor speaking from the perspective of the Church's work, saying, "We have corrected thy work and have founded it upon miracle, mystery and authority. And men rejoiced that they were again led like sheep, and that the terrible gift that had brought them such suffering, which is supposed to be spiritual freedom, was at least lifted from their hearts. Were we right teaching them this? Speak, did we not love mankind, so meekly acknowledging their feebleness, lovingly lightening their burden, and permitting their weak nature even sin with our sanction?" End quote. Now, if those correlations don't rock you in some way, I really don't know what will in relation to the modern times in which we are living in, especially if you're in Europe at the moment. They should remind you of why these writers are so damn important, because to add even more to the mix, the written piece called the Ground Inquisitor, as in the way it was written, actually predicted the authoritarianism that would arise in 20 or 30 so years after its publication. So I don't need to say much more on that, except for the fact that I'm obviously not claiming any truths about conspiracy or anything like that. Of course, I am just pointing out some very weird, spectacular correlations in relation to this literature. Because we need to remember, this entire piece is about individual freedom being taken away from the people to supposedly reduce suffering. That's the philosophical idea behind it, to make people comfortable with the authority being preached to them. Because if you are the individual, you are going to be a rebel. And the twisted philosophy that Ivan presents is, how can you be happy if you are a free being, a rebel? Well, maybe people don't want to be happy. Maybe happiness is just a byproduct, a very beneficial byproduct of a meaningful life. And this is why the Grand Inquisitor is wrong. Because you cannot place a new social system without knowing or allowing the people to figure out what they actually want or need. Because that is the entire point of the general will, sovereignty, the social pact in which Rousseau talks about in the social contract. So to get back on track, we can see in a weird way how the church in the poem are, in a Nietzschean sense, acting out a slave morality. While Nietzsche would claim that this is obviously negative and against the will to power, the Grand Inquisitor would claim the opposite. Even though Nietzsche said that the teachings of excessive Christian humbleness in the church was of a slave morality, the Grand Inquisitor is against the teachings of spiritual freedom which Jesus portrayed and brought about in the world. So there is this weird reversal. One agrees with it and one doesn't, but overall the church from both of these writers are demonstrated in the same way. So with all this so far, we can start to see the ethical landscape or philosophical landscape, which Ivan, as the Grand Inquisitor, is trying to propose, and how, through this conversation with Alyosha, who is very spiritual and religious, is trying to convince him. In the end, the second coming of Christ pecks the Inquisitor on his cold lips when he's said all he has to say. The reason for this is unexplained by Dostoevsky, but can be understood as Jesus trying to re-establish a Christian ethic, or him simply showing the reaction of the new world in which will be the death of God in the hands of the new people such as the Grand Inquisitor, with people who don't accept a cohesive morality, in a sense. Because beforehand, in his other novel, Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov attempted to be the Übermensch. He was a man that fell out of love with God and tried to manifest his own values, using the slave and master dichotomy and believing that anything and everything was lawful. But when he did, he fell into a misery, realising that murder, even when he thought it was justified to realise his own elite being, was actually an action of killing himself. He even talks about the slave-master Nietzschean dichotomy in Crime and Punishment, saying, People are divided according to the law of nature into two categories, a lower or, so to speak, material category, serving solely for the reproduction of their own kind, and people proper, that is, those who have the gift or talent of speaking a new word in their environment. End quote. But this Inquisitor is also an attempt of being a superior man in the Nietzschean sense, this Superman, sacrificing the teachings of Christ, but for him accepting the Antichrist as being the true leader of the church. Again, in a strange way, the Grand Inquisitor represents the Übermensch because he is trying to develop his own values, but also which is antithetical, admires a slave morality after testing different values, which resides in a happiness for being humble and not in being strong and powerful with the use of spiritual freedom. I quote, this is what the Grand Inquisitor says, "I too have been in the wilderness. I too have lived on roots and locusts. I too prize the freedom with which thou hast blessed man. And I too was striving to stand among thy elect, among the strong and powerful, thirsting to make up the number. But I awakened and would not serve madness. I turned back and joined the ranks of those who have corrected thy work. I left the proud and went back to the humble for the happiness of the humble." End quote. But Alyosha, who Ivan is telling the story to, who represents Jesus in this case, does the same. He kisses Ivan and pecks him on the lips. And this kiss too resembles unending faith and love over the rational atheist. It shows understanding that Alyosha has understanding over these issues of doubt, but also his virtuous character for good intentions. This makes both Christ and Alyosha more virtuous in the face of Ivan and the Grand Inquisitor. Overall, this is a story which tells the philosophy of taking away individual spiritual freedom in order for there to be a world with less suffering, or more precisely putting social systems and governments first before spiritual individual freedom and virtue. Thus it be a warning to the changes of social and political systems. This chapter continues to be relevant to this very moment in time, and probably will be forever. The reason why Ivan is wrong is because he places a social political system ahead of what people cherish the most, and through doing so he idolizes comfort over virtue. Even when virtue is difficult, it still is more valuable, as no man with any ethics would exist otherwise. Even when freedom is more valuable than residing in a hidden, unchanging comfort, it guides the human race down a path of what is believed to be best for the people and the individual. Three bases, with regards to the world and its people around us. Therefore, spiritual freedom is necessary to try and be what is best. So there's a lot of bits and bobs I went over with on that, so I might make a few other videos to really analyse some specifics within that poem. So if you enjoyed this video and found it insightful, make sure to like, subscribe and comment down below to get involved in discussion. Talking about discussion, you can find a link to the Thoughts on Thinking Facebook group down below, so make sure to join if you want to get involved in conversations about philosophy, sociology, literature and psychology. Make sure to follow my social medias such as Instagram and Twitter to keep up to date with everything that is going on, and also Patreon, where you can donate a minimum of $2. Lastly, a quick shout out to all my patrons. Thank you to Danielle Kazmi, The Truthism, Noah Shahad, John, Bizham, Richard, Walter, Mark Smith, Maggie DC, Dari, Nikki, Sarah, Jay, Aaron C, Anders and James for supporting me on Patreon. As always, thanks for watching and I'll speak to you in the next video.